Now, it's hard to believe it's been 30 years since Heir to the Empire first came out, a book that many considered, and some certainly still consider, a sequel or the start of a sequel trilogy of books to the original Star Wars trilogy, as it would pick up the story of many of the original characters from those films 5 years after Return of the Jedi had ended, and with the war between the remnants of the Empire and the fledgling New Republic still ongoing. But what's even harder to believe, for me personally anyway, is that, until a few days ago when I read it again, is that it also been 30 years since the one and only time I read that book, which might lead you to believe I didn't enjoy it back then and never wanted to revisit it, or that in general maybe I just don't read very often, or that I just never reread books as a rule or something. However, none of those three things are true. I love reading and will reread my favorites all the time. For example, I've read the Lord of the Rings trilogy over a half dozen times in my life, and I also do consider Heir to the Empire and the whole Thrawn trilogy to be some of my favorite books ever. In fact, of all the books I've ever read, I'm not sure any has stuck with me quite the same way Heir to the Empire did or has, which is probably the main reason I have never gone back to reread it. It's just stuck with me so well over the years. And I don't just mean the book itself, but to the point where I remember the excitement I felt waiting for it to be released, for the story of Star Wars to continue after Return of the Jedi had come out roughly 8 years prior. And at that age, and mind you, I was 13 in 1991 when Heir to the Empire came out, 8 years feels like an absolute eternity. It felt like forever since I'd seen Return of the Jedi in the theater for the first time at the age of 5. But those long years did give me plenty of time to watch over and over and over again Return of the Jedi, as well as the first two films in the trilogy, to the point where I'd probably watched Jedi, my favorite of the three, somewhere around 100 times, literally. And after nearly every viewing, I'd imagine what happens next, or I didn't act it out with my old Kenner action figures. I always wanted to see that story continue, to go on another adventure with these characters I loved. And though I can't remember how I heard about the book in the first place, or that it was coming out, I do recall the wait for that book and the Sunday afternoon my mom took me to a Walden's bookstore in the mall so I could pick up a copy with my allowance. I then remember going home and reading it for pretty much the rest of the day, and reading it as much as I could over the next few days, despite school and all the other fun stuff there is to do, until I finally finished it, and I remember loving and cherishing every single page along the way. And what was almost uncanny, you could say, while rereading it a few days ago, was something I've never experienced with any other book I've reread, which is many. But I would get these, I guess you could call them flashbacks to the first time I read the book. And I don't mean I was suddenly remembering the book. I actually found I did indeed pretty much remember all of it quite clearly after all this time, which kind of surprised me. But what I mean is I could remember where exactly I originally was, or what was going on around me at the time, or even what I was thinking the first time reading it 30 years ago. Certain parts or passages would just trigger these very vivid memories, and I could only imagine that was because of how focused and excited I was while reading it that first time. By the way I was treating it back then, my brain must have just thought this was extremely important, and it needed to be saved for all time. I even remember reading it extra slow just to take it all in and to make sure I understood everything. And mind you, I wasn't exactly an exceptionally fast reader back then to begin with, mainly because reading was something I pretty much only started to do or started to enjoy because of that book, and because Heir to the Empire was essentially, or in a way, the first of many Star Wars books to come. It was very much the beginning of my journey through the expanded universe of Star Wars. And it came out at pretty much the perfect time for me, because in 1991, and again at the age of 13, Star Wars was not only in what you might call a dark time, or a time where there wasn't much in terms of content, beyond perhaps the West End Games RPG, which I never played, but, and to be honest, Star Wars was starting to slip from my mind. I was growing up, and other things were becoming more interesting or more important to me than watching Return of the Jedi for the 101st time, and busting out my action figures that had seen better days. And though sure, when the special editions came out and the prequels started later in that decade, I know I would have returned to Star Wars to some degree and been very excited for them, but what I don't know is just how excited I would have been for them if not for what Heir to the Empire kept alive and going strong, or maybe I should say reinvigorated in me, which was my love and passion for Star Wars. I don't know that I'd be here today talking Star Wars if it wasn't for that book, and for the rest of the expanded universe that followed, all the books, comics, games, and so on. Not all of which I've consumed, mind you. It may surprise or even disappoint you perhaps, but there are parts of it I missed along the way due to any number of life circumstances, though I do want to go back and experience those pieces that I missed along the way. And if people are interested, I will make videos about them and just more videos about Legends in general. But to kind of get to the book itself now, and this is mainly going to be some then and now thoughts or observations, not exactly a full-on review or recap, but do know there will be plenty of spoilers, and I know this might be odd to give a spoiler warning for something that's 30 years old, but if you're someone who has always wanted to read this book and just hasn't yet, and you don't want the whole thing ruined, it might be a good time to stop the video. Though I'm guessing a lot of Star Wars fans who've never read it still kind of know a great deal about this book almost by default. But anyway, the biggest difference between my 2 times reading it, besides my age, is the first time I read it was obviously years before the prequel trilogy came out, which means, along with getting to see what happens after Return of the Jedi, it was also very exciting to get little tidbits about the past, or about what we now often refer to as the prequel or Clone Wars era, though there are not many mentions of it, or of that time, or of the war in the book. Which is ultimately a good thing, since what we do get doesn't make a whole lot of sense compared to what we ultimately got or saw in the prequels and or Clone Wars animated series. And most references to the Clone Wars in this particular book are sort of vague at best and make it seem like there was maybe some type of battle against mutant clones gone crazy or something. At least that's what I remember taking away from it years ago when I first read it. And even though that's obviously wrong, it's still interesting to know or see what someone else thought or envisioned the Clone Wars to be before we got that answer from George Lucas himself in the prequels. And what's funny or cool is that Timothy Zahn, the author of the book, actually kind of made them seem like they were what I always thought the Clone Wars probably were, which was Jedi fighting against an endless army of cloned, maybe mutant warriors of some kind. And I always back then thought Palpatine used the clone army to defeat and destroy the Jedi, and that's how he also destroyed the Republic and took over the whole galaxy and created the Empire and so on, and that he left the Senate intact for some reason until A New Hope. And I was kind of right about all that, I guess, or I was right from a certain point of view at least. But speaking of all that, there's no real mention or talk about how the Empire came to be, or how long it's existed, or how Palpatine came to power. Nor is Anakin Skywalker ever talked about at all in the book. In fact, I don't think his name is even mentioned. I was going to pay attention to that, and I didn't. This, of course, was basically by design, though, per instruction of George Lucas, who didn't want any of that stuff touched upon, especially Anakin's fall to the dark side. Though it is interesting to note that Coruscant is in this book, and this is the first time it's mentioned or seen, and it's an idea that Lucas basically takes from the book and inserts in the prequels. Another rather strange after-the-fact thing, or that doesn't fit anymore but made sense to me back in the day, is that Vader and Palpatine are simply referred to as Dark Jedi. In fact, the word Sith is nowhere to be found in this book, though it almost was in there, since Timothy Zahn was originally going to call the Nogri, he was going to call them the Sith, since they essentially were a race or a species that worshipped Darth Vader. And this was because in the deleted scene of A New Hope, Vader is referred to by Tarkin as the Dark Lord of the Sith, so Zahn thought it would make sense then that the Sith were a species or a sect of people that worshipped Vader, and not the Sith as we know them today, which are basically the opposite of the Jedi. Kind of going along with this then, with there being no Sith, there is not much touched on when it comes to Jedi philosophy or Jedi lore or the Jedi way, or what their greater purpose even is or might be. Just like in the original trilogy, there's a sort of vague feeling around the whole thing, which isn't bad or anything, and it actually makes the Force still feel very rare and like a very mysterious thing like it did in that first trilogy. Nevertheless, it is one that Luke does have a good handle on in the book. He comes off feeling like a trained or fully fledged Jedi Knight, and he's mainly focused on training Leia here, more so than, say, seeking out more knowledge or finding new students or anything like that. In fact, when an apparent Jedi from the past or from the Clone Wars emerges, Luke's not exactly falling all over himself to seek him out. And I'm of course talking about Jerus Sabaoth, who is a clone of Joruus Sabaoth, though as a kid when I came across that name in the book, I always just called him Joruus Seabath because I had no clue how you were supposed to pronounce that, and there are many such names in this book that are not easy to figure out or pronounce. But anyway, early in the book, basically at the very beginning, Zahn I think makes a somewhat disappointing but probably necessary choice and a wise one in the long run, which is that the Force Ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi comes to Luke and basically tells him that he has to go, that the Force Ghosts have to move on essentially, and that their time was limited. And like I just said, that's a pretty wise or smart choice because the Force Ghosts do present a huge story problem, that being why they're not helping out all the time or always telling Luke what he needs to know when he needs to know it, or warning him about, oh I don't know, Grand Admiral Thrawn or Sabayoth for example. Though of course back then we didn't know, well, really anything at all about the Force Ghosts, that there was anything truly special about them. We thought all Jedi might become Force Ghosts when they died, other than Kenobi saying of course that if you strike me down I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine to Darth Vader in A New Hope. We didn't know that they were really all that big of a deal. And for all we really knew, they were just ghosts that could talk to the living, that they didn't know everything in any sort of way or exist in a place that is non-linear like we would learn about later in the Clone Wars, meaning they could, of course, see past, present, and future, and therefore represent a big problem for storytelling like I was talking about before. So anyway, though kind of annoying maybe to just have Obi-Wan show up at the start to say goodbye and that being that for the Force Ghosts, I do think ultimately it was a good idea to sort of remove them from the equation. And speaking of annoying, I think my least favorite part of Heir to the Empire, or aspect of it, was that Luke Skywalker spends roughly half the book sort of depowered or disconnected from the Force, thanks to the Ysalamiri, or small tree-dwelling lizard creatures that can block the Force, and when they're in great numbers they can repel large areas of the Force, or kind of create these Force-free bubbles, you could call them. Now, when I originally read the book all those years ago, the concept itself didn't really irritate me or stick out to me, or the concept of creatures that could repel the Force, I mean. Again, I was just unhappy it meant Luke had to spend roughly half the book without Force powers, which is something I was very eager to, of course, see him using the Force in cool ways, I mean. Nowadays, though, considering how much we know about the Force compared to then, I'm not sure how much sense they really make. I mean, if we go by sequel trilogy lore, sure, Luke could disconnect himself from the Force, which, no, still doesn't make a ton of sense either. But the idea that something could block one's ability to connect with the Force or use it, sort of like an anti-magic shell, I don't know about that one. You'd think it would kill the person if it was severing their connection to the Force, but nevertheless, it was in there, and it didn't really bug me to read about it again. I'm just saying there's a discussion to be had about the Ysalamiri. Anyway then, Luke spends a good deal of this story depowered or disconnected from the Force, and out in the forest as a prisoner of Mara Jade, who is both the perfect foil and perfect fit for Luke. There's just something about these two together that, reading it both then and now, just works, and you can feel their chemistry kind of coming off the page. You want her to get over whatever this reason is that she hates him, which you do learn about in the book. And for the two to become, well, to become friends, you could say, you are really rooting for the two of them. And not to get too far off topic, but Mara Jade, who over the years became one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars, anyway, she's one of the reasons why I hate this weird assertion or new narrative that many Star Wars fans hate or don't want women in Star Wars or female characters in Star Wars. I mean, here is a character that is, in many ways, a challenge and rival to none other than Luke Skywalker. She even gets the best of him at many points in the story. And yet, the first time I read the book as a 13-year-old boy nonetheless, I never once got upset that the first time I'm seeing Luke since Return of the Jedi, essentially my childhood hero right here, and he's being upstaged by a girl of all things. Instead, I loved the character from the start, and I just wanted, like I said before, for the two of them to get along, and it was awesome to see her slowly start to come around just a bit. And when it ends, when they go their separate ways, you are hoping the two will encounter each other again. Furthermore, I've also never heard anyone else complain about Mara Jade in this book, or from anywhere else, for that matter, in the expanded universe. And it makes me miss the days when characters in stories could just be characters in stories. They didn't have to necessarily mean or represent something in the real world. A great female character back then could just be a great character. But anyway, Mara Jade is not the only popular or well-known character to make their first appearance in this book. We also meet, of course, Grand Admiral Thrawn for the very first time, who is, intentionally so on the part of Timothy Zahn, a very different type of villain, one with a brilliant strategic mind, and who works with and has some level of care and concern for his subordinates. Which is in stark contrast to, say, Darth Vader, where if you don't get it right, you die when it comes to those under him, though yes, Thrawn can also be very ruthless with his subordinates as well. And I'm sure Palpatine is the same way as Vader, or actually worse. There is, after all, what Vader said in Return of the Jedi, that Palpatine is not as forgiving as he is, which is terrifying to think. Anyway, in some respects, I'd say that Thrawn's intelligence, his ability to always be a step, if not several steps ahead of our heroes, and see what's truly going on, or to see the bigger picture, or to predict what's going to happen next, makes him a scarier villain than a Vader or a Palpatine. His cool, calm composure is also equally chilling somehow, and he is a very awesome contrast to the other villains we've seen in Star Wars, again like Vader or Palpatine. He was truly the perfect sort of villain for this story. And speaking of that story, the most curious observation I made this time around that I didn't exactly realize the first time through all those years ago, back then I for whatever reason just thought this was a massive and epic tale, was actually how simple the story really is, which I don't mean as any sort of insult, only that in a way this is more character driven than plot driven, and certainly way more than I remember, not that I really knew the difference back then. Basically, it's not a story like, say, A New Hope, where there's something big that needs to be stopped or that needs to happen or accomplished before it's too late and will spell doom for the galaxy. This is more like The Empire Strikes Back, where the larger story is certainly there, but more or less takes a backseat to the characters finding themselves in challenging situations and us learning more about the characters, or them learning more about themselves, and them growing along the way. Which isn't then to say that the plot is slow or meandering, where we have long, endless chapters devoid of action and where characters are just standing around and talking, or where nothing of interest is happening. There's a good amount of action in here, quite a bit actually, and the pace of the book is pretty brisk overall. You never really get bored with the story or feel like things are slowing down too much. And speaking of the characters then, all the original ones are indeed here, and very well written. They feel or sound like you remember them from the films. You can see them and hear them in your mind's eye with ease. This feels like a Star Wars story, which, after reading I don't know how many Star Wars books over the years now, it's not always easy to capture that feeling in the written form. I've read many books in my time that just feel off, you could say. The only sort of issue I have at all with Zahn's writing is perhaps a slight overuse of familiar phrases or sayings or winks and nods or nudges to previous events from the films, which I wouldn't say bothers me or anything. You just can't help but notice they happen quite often. There's always references to events or them saying lines from the films, but at least the characters, the main characters from the original trilogy, are together often and interacting with each other frequently, unlike a certain sequel trilogy I know where some characters never even interact with each other at all ever again. And speaking of that, as I talked about a bit at the beginning, I have always seen Heir to the Empire and the whole Thrawn trilogy as the sequels to the original trilogy, though kind of by default since they were the first post-Return of the Jedi story to come out, and I say kind of by default mainly because there were eventually going to be a lot of post-Return of the Jedi stories that could sort of work or qualify as a sequel trilogy. But this one, again, was the first, and it tells us what happens next, what becomes of our favorite characters shortly after the end of the original trilogy. And speaking of the sequels, or the sequel trilogy we eventually got, what's interesting to note, even though, yes, the main characters of the original trilogy are prominently featured in Heir to the Empire, is that they don't exactly dominate the book entirely. I already mentioned Thrawn and Mara Jade, and how great they are and how they shine alongside the original cast of characters. But there are others like Talon Karrde, for example, who are quite fascinating and well written, and don't take a back seat to the well-known characters. And I'd actually say he's one of the most interesting of the book overall, because you're never quite sure what to make of him. You're not sure what side he's going to ultimately fall on, because the side he's on is actually his own, but even though he's someone who kind of takes the spot of Jabba the Hutt or fills that void a bit, that doesn't mean he just comes off as this ruthless and selfish bad guy who is of course going to do bad things because, again, he's a bad guy. Instead, he basically has a code. He looks at things and reasons them out and acts accordingly. There's a logic behind the way the character works. Go figure. Again, he's not just a bad guy for the sake of being a bad guy, and hence he doesn't just do bad things. In fact, he doesn't even end up on the bad guy side at the end. Just like Thrawn and Mara Jade, he's a character that jumps off the page at you and feels real because he does things that make sense and therefore doesn't automatically get outshined by the original characters who are, no surprise, again very heavily featured. And that is very impressive, especially when you consider people are or were mainly buying and reading the book for the original characters, for the continuation of those stories, but you end up loving and getting vested in the new ones just as much, until, fast forward to nowadays, some of the characters he created then are, by those who know them, which isn't everybody, but some of those characters are just as beloved as those original characters. That is a truly impressive feat. And I can't help but think of J.J. Abrams saying how one of the reasons why he didn't want to use Luke Skywalker in The Force Awakens was because he didn't want him to outshine the new characters, and yet Timothy Zahn proved years ago that, if done right, you can get the best of both worlds. You can have a fantastic story mainly centered around the original characters, but also incorporate new ones that the audience will quickly gravitate towards and care about as well. And for me, that's kind of the lasting legacy of Heir to the Empire. I originally read that book all those years ago to see what happens next to my favorite characters, and somehow along the way, it produced new favorite characters. Which is a surprise to be sure, but proof that Star Wars can have a long, bright future ahead of it as long as talented people keep bringing us new, great characters like Thrawn and Mara Jade, and so on. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of Heir to the Empire, assuming you've read it. And if you have read it, when did you read it? Back in the day, recently, or multiple times over the years? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.